Hello, you all. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Steele to come here to UT and then give us this seminar about Mars magnetic field. So Sarah's work combines paleomagnetic experiments as well as numerical modeling to tell us a lot more about the magnetic evolution history on Mars. Um, so please join me in welcoming Sarah and let's hear from Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Is my mic working? I hit the switch. All good? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you all for having me, and thanks, Chief, for that very nice introduction. So today I'm going to talk a lot about Mars's really early magnetic history, but where I actually like to start is with the magnetic field above Mars today. So this is a plot showing the magnetic field strength about 200 kilometers above the surface of Mars as of like 2019. So unless there's any major changes in the last year, this is like pretty up to date. But one thing that might stick out is how heterogeneous the field is. There's a lot of small scale structure, and this is not really what we would expect to see if Mars, like the Earth, had like an active core dynamo today. So we're not actually looking at a field that's produced currently in the deep interior, but we're instead seeing our crustal fields, or sort of fossilized fields from an earlier dynamo. Basically, what's happening is common iron-bearing minerals and rocks, things like magnetite or pyrrhotite, when they're heated enough, they kind of lose any existing permanent remnants that they have. And they're kind of free to reorient so that when they cool below like a range of temperatures, they acquire a new magnetization in whatever the ambient field direction is. And so you can get these fossilized, like preserved magnetic fields that are stable over billion-year timescales, long after whatever the ambient magnetic field at the time was, long after that has changed or is removed. And then because you have these massive bodies of magnetized rock, those produce their own magnetic field that we can go and send spacecraft. And then when we look at Mars today, that's what we're seeing, are these old fossilized magnetic fields that were produced by crust magnetized in some earlier dynamo. So this tells us that Mars, early in its history, must have had an active core dynamo like the Earth. And so, of course, one of the biggest questions in the field is, when did that dynamo shut down? One way that people have tried to answer that is by looking at these big impact basins. So there's more impact basins than this on Mars, of course, but these are like the four most famous ones. And you can kind of see they almost look like holes punched into the magnetic background. Like they're really weakly magnetic. And that kind of contradicts with what I said earlier about if you heat a lot of material and cool it, which of course impacts do, if that occurs in the presence of a dynamo, you would expect these to be really strongly magnetized bodies. They should have really, really pronounced magnetic signatures, but they don't. So one of the most like straightforward interpretations of that is that the dynamo actually turned off before these basins formed. And that would be a pretty early cessation, so like 4.1 billion years ago, Mars lost its dynamo. But some really sharp-eyed scientists have picked out some younger volcanic features on Mars's surface that seem like they formed while a field was active. And it's quite hard, we think, to restart a dynamo once it turns off, at least for Mars. Like you can imagine, it's kind of easier to maintain convection in the core than it would be to initiate it to begin with. So it's kind of hard to understand how there can be this evidence for a dynamo active as late as like 3.5 billion years ago, while simultaneously there's like a pretty good case maybe that the dynamo turned off 4.1. Like there's this big gap. So there's these two conflicting hypotheses. So early cessation, that's before 4.1, late cessation after about 3.9. This might not sound like a huge age gap. It's like 200 million years out of like a 4.5 billion year history, but it could be pretty important for understanding of Mars's interior. In particular, the dynamo turns off when convection in the core ends. So this is telling us something about how quickly Mars's core is losing heat when it's ending its convection rate. And so that's really sensitive to the like thermal and electrical properties of the core and other properties of the mantle. And so also delaying the cessation, like it's already kind of hard in models to get a dynamo that ends like at 4.1. The core kind of has to start a little hot, or you have to have like really particular properties of the core, like a particular core conductivity. And so to delay that cessation another 500, possibly million years is quite a long time. So this could be like a really useful way to learn about the deep interior of Mars. It's a very hard question to answer, even with the seismic data that we do now have from InSight. The other thing that possibly you're more familiar with, there's this narrative about how planetary magnetic fields interact with their atmospheres. So you hear a lot like Earth's magnetic field kind of shields us from the solar wind, and that's part of why we're habitable. And that may or may not be true. This is actually like a really debated question, how important magnetic fields are in regulating atmospheric loss and what that role actually is. So it's possible if Mars's magnetic field was weak enough, and like for certain structures, you could actually like siphon off the atmosphere. So this could be like a really complicated relationship. But if the cessation was a little bit later, that kind of brings it closer to this time period where we're seeing a lot of valley network formation and the end of surface water on Mars. And so it could be a more sort of suggestive relationship between the dynamo cessation and this massive climate change event that Mars went through. So like it's a really important 200 million years for Mars. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is like my PhD work. So I defended it in September. And I was really focused on these two questions. So first of all, how robust are these different constraints on Mars's magnetic history? Like, and how, like, which interpretations do we trust? Because these seem to be two conflicting narratives. And what else can we add to the timeline that maybe gives us a little, more solid information? And is there any magnetic history for Mars that we can imagine that can simultaneously reconcile all of these observations? So the place I want to start is actually with a piece of Mars. So this is ALH, or Allen Hills, 84001. It's kind of a famous meteorite. You may have heard, like Bill Clinton has talked about this because there was this whole like magnetofossil potential habitability or potential fossil in this meteorite. So it's kind of famous for that. It's also one of the earliest meteorites that we recognize came from Mars. So it's one of the most studied rocks in history, which is very convenient if you're trying to do paleomag, as it turns out. But this is an orthoperoxenite that crystallized about 4.1 billion years ago. So like right in the sweet spot that we're interested in knowing about. And it experienced several early impact events and then also its ejection. So one of the things that we're fortunate enough to know from previous studies of this meteorite is there are two main magnetic populations. So there's these chromite sulfide assemblages, and these are primary igneous minerals. So these are potentially able to carry a remnants as old as the rock itself, so 4.1. But they're also, for reasons that will become clear in a moment, quite hard to actually study. The second population are the carbonates. These have magnetite rims. These are much more studied, in part because they were of potential astrobiological significance, but they happen to be a little bit younger. So the oldest possible remnants that these could have is about 3.95. So earlier magnetic studies of this meteorite show this really, really weird pattern. Like I mentioned earlier that rocks acquire magnetization in a magnetic field, or if they do, they will be strongly magnetized. But you kind of expect all of the magnetization in a rock to be sort of in the same direction. And instead, what we see is a lot of individual sources that are really strongly magnetized. Like they look like they were in a really strong magnetic field, but they're oriented in different directions. And that's really weird. It's not like brecciated enough to explain this. It's just a super complicated magnetization pattern that we don't really understand. But we also know that the interior wasn't heated very much when the rock like fell into Earth's atmosphere. And so we know that everything more than a few millimeters interior needs to be like from Mars, magnetizations from Mars. So what's kind of motivated revisiting this is like we have this major advance in magnetic imaging technologies. So this is like the previous state of the art squid microscope, still an amazing tool. But you can see like all these black spots in the meteorite, and there's like that orange field. Oh wait, I have a pointer. Does it work? Yeah, so like these are carbonates, and then all these little black spots are the chromites. You don't really have enough resolution to actually, like you can see there's magnetic signatures associated with them, but it's hard to pick out magnetic signatures from different things. It's just really hard to interpret. But in the last 10 years, with the development of the quantum diamond microscope, or the QDM, which is just a new magnetic imaging tool that gets down to like micron scale resolution, we just finally now have the tools that we need to resolve this magnetization and try to answer this like more difficult question. It's pretty exciting. But we do need to go through this sort of complicated process of getting from these images to something quantifiable. So there's this three-step process of like isolating whatever your magnetic source is you're interested in, simulating the magnetic imagery a little bit higher off the sample to smooth out any like fine structure, and then calculating this best fit dipole. So you get a unique direction and magnetic moment for each of these like chromite sulfide assemblages. I'm probably just going to call them chromites because that's like a mouthful. The other problem is I mentioned that rocks acquire, even like these single grain assemblages, acquire magnetization over a whole broad range of temperatures. And so something that can happen is even if you have like a grain of material that's acquired its magnetization in some like earlier heating event, maybe it's heated up a little bit upon Earth entry, not enough to totally reset the magnetization, but enough to reset like that lower temperature component, like that population of grains that's like a little bit magnetically softer. And so we have to go through this process where we remove the magnetization in steps to kind of reconstruct these vectors of magnetization. So this is like an example of that. This is a really neat demagnetization because at each step you could see that the like magnetic, like the magnetization that we're removing is all in the same direction. So that tells you there's this whole big population that was all magnetized in one direction and not like super overprinted later. But this is just like a really important step for kind of filtering out sources that might be bad magnetic recorders, and also making sure that the like magnetization that we're studying so carefully is actually something that was acquired at a high temperature, like during one of these big impact events. Then we can also get like a clearer direction. So we can either do thermal demagnetization, so we actually heat the rock as like a one-to-one analog of like how that magnetization would have been acquired originally, or we can do these sort of non-destructive analog alternating field demagnetization to like just kind of go from like a bigger population of candidate like chromites that seem like they might have a good strong magnetic signature in the maps, like the original maps, like right after we get the sample, to a set of like robust, good, clear directions. And so when we did that, we had about like, you can imagine like a pinto bean amount of this meteorite to work with to begin with. And I think we ended up working with about a third of it, so 3 slices, maybe 40 chromites in all. All of that work, like hundreds of hours of imaging to get down to 12 really good, trustworthy directions. And so that's what I'm showing you here. And you notice again, I pointed out earlier that there's this heterogeneous magnetization inside, but it's a little bit clearer here that these seem to fall into these 2, both independently and jointly statistically significant clusters. We were quite careful to also only look at sources deeper in the interior because we really aren't trying to see, like we don't want to mix this up with that fusion crust direction. But we can also see that it doesn't match, neither of the cluster directions match the direction of magnetization that was acquired when the meteorite came to Earth. So these seem to be 2 older like populations of magnetization. And something that supports that as well is when we calculate the magnetic field intensity that you need to produce like the magnetizations for each individual source. These are like quite high paleo intensities. So this is like higher than like a very, very large fraction of surface crustal fields on Mars. So this is really suggestive that these are directions that were acquired in the presence of a dynamo. We also, I don't always talk about this, but we also found this really cool third population that seems like it acquired its remnants in a really, really weak field, like less than 5 microtesla. For reference, Earth's magnetic field strength is like probably 30 to 50 microtesla, so like tens. So these are like, the other 2 populations are kind of Earth strength-ish. But there's this third population that it really straightforwardly acquires a field in the lab, but it doesn't seem like it was previously magnetized. So this is really weird, right? Like, how do you get in the same, like, literally like centimeters squared of material, 3 different magnetization directions? And also, what do we like read into this really big angular separation between the directions in these first 2 clusters? So it turned out that some people at Imperial College London were kind of already working on this problem. I mentioned earlier that like the main heating events that ALH 840001 experienced were impacts. And the thing with impacts is they actually heat rocks very heterogeneously at like the millimeter scale. And so we worked with this team and they actually simulated impacts into one of our slices of ALH 840001. And so you can see, this is like quite a large impact here that I'm showing, like a 30 GPa event. So that's quite a lot. But you can see the heating is like really not uniform. And the chromites themselves, which are these like black features here again, stay really cold the entire time, even for pretty big impacts. So the only chromites that you would expect to be heated during these events are those that happen to be near a shear zone or near some carbonate field or something else that's like driving the heating, which just totally depends on the impact angle and what's around it. But in general, we would actually expect the interior of this rock, different chromites, to record magnetizations from different impact events and different ages. And so one way that we could imagine reconstructing this history is you begin with some uniformly magnetized ALH 840001, either from when it formed or this early metamorphic event, really big impact, something early. And if Mars's dynamo, like the Earth, experiences polarity reversals, which is something that's been proposed for Mars kind of a number of times, but mostly based on interpretation of those crustal fields that I was showing earlier. But that's like a really hard problem. It's super non-unique. So it's still really debated whether this kind of feature we take for granted in the Earth's dynamo also applied to Mars, this polarity reversal. But if this dynamo experienced a polarity reversal and like kind of before this second impact event in ALH 840001, we could actually be recording two different polarities in the same meteorite. And that's sort of what we would expect to happen, right? Alternatively, you can also get the same thing if you just like turn the rock over, which is a lot less exciting, but I mean, we can't rule it out. It's a little bit harder, I will say, like without the same sort of system of plate tectonics that we have on Earth. It's a little bit harder to get the same kind of large overturns of buried rocks. So it's not clear how likely this is, but in any case, this could be evidence of reversals on Mars, which would be really, really exciting. Another thing that's more certain and also probably more important is if we relate this then to the known ages of these impact events, we find that it actually requires that we have a dynamo active at least at 3.9 GA and likely also at 4.0. So this is right in that window between the early and late cessation hypotheses, right? And so this would align with this later cessation, longer-lived dynamo hypothesis. So it seems like we've been able to add something to the timeline that kind of convincingly argues for like a longer dynamo lifetime on Mars than we would have originally thought. But it still leaves us with this question of like what to make of these big impact basins that look so weakly magnetic. But if we look at ALH 840001, that could also be a clue as to like a way that we could do that, right? So if you look at ALH 840001 from kind of far away, because you have these two populations that are almost oppositely magnetized, it looks really weakly magnetic from any distance. And then you get close and you see there's a lot more strong local magnetization. Impact basins, it's not the same exact mechanism for like recording at different times, but they do cool very slowly. They cool over hundreds of millions of years. So if you cool an impact basin in a constant magnetic field, of course, you do get this large volume of stuff that's really magnetic. But if you cool it in a field that's changing polarity, you would actually expect to sort of get this layered structure that could be a really small net magnetization. So you get a really small magnetic field at altitude. This is like the second kind of piece of this broader work, which is trying to figure out, is that process efficient enough to make basins that look as non-magnetic as we see today? So I'll get a little less into the weeds on this part, but basically just running cooling models of impact basins on Mars, finite element, mostly just conductive cooling. But what we can do is we can take the cooling history at each location and compare it or combine it with this. This is called a magnetic blocking or unblocking spectrum, which basically just describes how magnetization is acquired as material cools. So if you have the cooling history and you know how magnetization is acquired with temperature, you can construct for everywhere in the basin like a time history of its magnetization acquisition. And so you can combine that then with randomly generated reversal histories to compute the magnetization for the basin as a whole. So this is like a little video of that process kind of happening. You can see the basin cooling, and then as the field is reversing, and all of these are like random reversal histories, not like periodic or anything, but you can see that it's developing this layered structure that we would expect, and like kind of a small net magnetization. And so then we can use that to reconstruct like a full 3D profile and calculate what the magnetic field would be at 200 kilometers altitude. So we have something we can directly compare to those magnetic field maps. And I'm going to start with just like 3 examples of what this could look like. So always referencing this like non-reversing case on the left, where indeed you have a big basin and it makes a big magnetic field and it looks nothing like anything we see today. If you have pretty slow reversals, maybe it still makes a big magnetic field because you just still have these large volumes of magnetization, and it's a pretty stochastic process at that point. But once you start getting into kind of rapid reversals, and I'm calling these rapid, but this is rapid in like a Earth Phanerozoic sense. We have no idea what to expect from Mars. It could be much, much faster than this even. But you start to see much more pronounced layering. Oh, much more pronounced layering developing here. But then what really sets the scale of magnetization is actually this really quickly cooled material at the surface. So it's never a perfect process. You do still need pretty quick reversals to have that like material at the surface that cools really quickly to have the magnetization from that be small. But this could be pretty efficient. So what we did is repeat this process for hundreds and hundreds of like random reversal histories at different rates. And so you can imagine taking the highest magnetic field strength from any of these maps and plotting it versus the average reversal rate. So that's what I'm showing here for all of those simulations. And essentially what we're saying is if you look at the actual impact basins that we're comparing to, it is relatively rare to have a magnetic field in the center of those that's higher than about 5 nanotesla. Those are sort of the strongest fields we see in basin interiors. And so if in our simulations, the strongest magnetic field we see is less than 5 nanotesla, that's a basin that would be, by any way that we classify Martian impact basins, considered demagnetized. This would be something that people look at and say, okay, there was no dynamo on when that formed. So for this particular case, you can see it's kind of on the edge. It's not actually clear if reversals in general are enough to make basins that look non-magnetic. Like it just really depends a lot on the specific reversal history, right? So that could be a little discouraging, but something that I kind of sneakily hid from you all, but maybe you guessed it, is this actually also depends a lot on what you assume about like what is carrying the magnetization, what magnetic stuff is in the rock and how much of it is there. So I've been taking what is sort of an intermediate assumption about this ferromagnetic mineral content. For that case, it depends a lot on the specific reversal history, like we said. But if, for instance, the interiors of basins are more similar to what we expect from Mars's southern highlands, which are really, really magnetic, maybe this mechanism doesn't work at all. On the other hand, something about Earth is that when we compare like mantle xenolith, stuff sourced from the mantle, magnetic properties of that material to stuff from the Earth's crust, it's actually orders of magnitude less magnetic. And impact basins this size remove almost all of the crust when they form. And so an alternative that's been proposed is that maybe you don't actually need reversals at all. Maybe it's enough to just remove all of that crustal material. And whatever's left is just so non-magnetic that maybe all basins should look totally demagnetized. And that's just a thing that happens. And it can't tell you anything about the magnetic field. So of course we want to know what assumption should we actually be making. And what I'm showing here, this is saturation remnants, which is just a quantity that relates basically how much like a magnetic field that a rock cools in to the magnetic field that it produces later, or the magnetization intensity that it acquires. But you can think of it just as a proxy for the amount of magnetic stuff in the rock. And so I'm showing the values for Martian meteorites. And you may notice that they actually span like 4 orders of magnitude. So it's like a huge range. And knowing what to assume is kind of tricky. So again, if we assume like quite high values, like Highlands values, reversals don't work. Intermediate, like crustal field derived values, which are still on the high end for Martian meteorites, I do want to note. It just becomes really sensitive to the specific reversal history. If we assume something similar either to like a median Martian meteorite or stuff from the Earth's mantle, then we start to actually be in this regime where basins would look strongly magnetized if they formed in a constant field, but reversals, even relatively slow reversals, are enough that we can't really confidently interpret this weak magnetism as evidence that the dynamo was off during that time. So the big takeaway here is that this is like a pretty compelling idea. It is not really, I wouldn't say it's responsible for us to look at weakly magnetic basins and conclude that the dynamo terminated early. I don't think there's a strong case for that anymore, but it does place some specific requirements on the magnetic properties of impact basins, which we don't know very much about. I should also note, when I was showing like Martian meteorite values, we don't actually have any material from Mars's mantle. There's no reason to assume that those span the right range, and that, like, 4 orders of magnitude, they could be the wrong 4 orders of magnitude. So the next question is, what do we actually expect? Can we do better? Can we create a better distribution? So this is like the third part of this work, is trying to understand what the magnetic mineralogies of impact basins on Mars could be. So for this, was using the Gibbs free energy minimization code, Perplex, just a really lovely tool for computational petrology, to basically model the crystallization of mantle-like compositions on Mars, or compositions that could be kind of intermediate between mantle and crustal, and get an estimate of the total magnetite content, and then use that to estimate the magnetic properties of these basins as a whole. And so we considered a pretty broad range of compositions. The goal here is not really to get the exact right answer. The goal is to get a really broad distribution that we feel probably contains the right answer, and see what that would imply about basin magnetism. So we're trying to really consider a broad range of possibilities. So considering both olivine ferric shergottites, which are the most kind of mantle-like meteorites that we do have, and then also some bulk mantle compositions. Also considering a really broad range of oxygen fugacities, because this could be something that's really heterogeneous in Mars's mantle and we don't know very well. Also considering different crystallization regimes, because this is something we also don't totally know. So either the purely fractional or purely equilibrium crystallization in members, or possibly this intermediate case where the melt pool starts to cool in equilibrium when the convection is really rapid, and then as you get a higher crystal fraction, there's not as much mixing and you transition to fractional crystallization. So considering that as well. And what we get at the end is this plot of, I'm showing here the difference. So the stars are fractional crystallization, circles are equilibrium crystallization, and squares are that intermediate. And then the different colors are all the different compositions. And this is all great. And what we really want is actually just this distribution here of weight percent magnetite. So that's the same exact distribution. And we can use that then and some just basic physical properties of magnetite, as well as this kind of funny empirical quantity, saturation remnants over saturation magnetization. It's sort of like an efficiency of remnants, but this depends a lot on the grain size of the mineral. So in general, finer grained material is more efficient at acquiring and holding stable magnetization. And so that could be faster cooled stuff near the surface will have a higher value, maybe up to 0.3 or 0.4, and slower cooled stuff at depth could have a lower value. So we're considering kind of a broad range here. But using this relationship, we can get from that weight percent magnetite to a saturation remnants. And that's something that we can actually use to calculate the magnetic field strength from a given parcel of material. Also, magnetite is not the only thing in Mars's crust that carries magnetism. It's just the only thing that was available in the petrology models that we have access to right now. So we also have to make an adjustment for pyrrhotite content, and we did so. So it doesn't change things super dramatically, but important to consider. And then this plot is sort of a lot, but because this is everything at once, just these broad distributions, considering both higher and lower pressures, deeper and shallower parts of the melt sheet, that doesn't have a huge effect, as you might notice. The one thing I want to point out, I said kind of offhand that coarser material tends to carry remnants less efficiently, has like a lower MRS over MS. That's actually not true for pyrrhotite. Pyrrhotite's really strange. And so we find that even for slowly cooled material, you're kind of forced to this higher range of saturation remnants if there's pyrrhotite present. So that's like all of the distributions. I'm showing different grain sizes and everything. And then I'm also showing at the top the remnant magnetization you would acquire in a 50 microtesla field, which is kind of roughly the right order of magnitude for Mars based on the magnetic studies we've done earlier. And based on that, you can see these two thresholds here. So threshold, or like the maximum saturation remnants for the magnetic field at 200 kilometers altitude to always be weaker than 5 nanotesla if, in this case, the basin cooled without reversals. That's a lot to take in. So I'm going to show some examples. For instance, this is something, a saturation remnants value and an NRM value that's kind of at the higher end of our distributions that we calculated, so about 1 ampere per meter. And I'm showing the magnetic field that would be produced by this basin if it was cooled in a non-reversing magnetic field compared to like the real basins that we have today. And you can see that's like way too strong. So probably a reversing dynamo would be, like, as far as we can tell, necessary, or excavation alone would be insufficient to account for the weak magnetism of this basin. If we take something that's on the lower end of our distributions, it actually still seems a little bit too strong if the dynamo is not reversing. These fields in the interior are quite high relative to the interiors of some of these basins. It is like kind of on the edge whether this would be required or not. And if we take the absolute lowest value on like literally the absolute tail of our distributions, we're finally starting to be in a regime where maybe you don't need the dynamo to be reversing. Just excavation would be enough because these basins just have such a depletion in magnetic material relative to the rest of the crust. So I guess the takeaway here is it's quite hard actually with excavation alone. There's like a moderate depletion in ferromagnetic minerals, like from mantle-derived materials on Mars probably, but it's not the orders of magnitude that we see for the Earth. So clearly there's something pretty different happening here. I mean, there's a lot of different things between Mars and Earth, so that's not necessarily surprising, but it's certainly less efficient of a process than we originally thought it might be. So as far as we can tell, probably we're kind of more in this regime where reversals are almost certainly an efficient way to make basins that look demagnetized, and they may be necessary to make them look demagnetized if the dynamo was on as late as we think it was. So I kind of said some of this already, but again, Martian impact basins should be depleted in magnetic minerals. That's an important like part of the point here. We can't model them just as extensions of the crust. But it might not be enough of an effect that this alone can explain their weak magnetism. We probably need something else if we believe the dynamo lived for so long. Yeah, so just to kind of synthesize everything. So we really started with this little tiny piece of a meteorite that seems to suggest the Martian dynamo lived a lot longer than we originally had like clear evidence for, and may have also been reversing. And if we take that long-lived but reversing framework, we find that it's actually also a really natural way to explain the weak magnetism of Mars's large impact basins. So we have successfully imagined a magnetic history that can simultaneously explain all of our observations, which is, I think, a really exciting development. But we don't know if it's right. Just because it's a satisfying explanation doesn't mean that it's correct. Sadly, that can happen. So I've done a lot of thinking about what things looking ahead we can use to actually test this hypothesis going forward. Something that people talk about is getting like helicopters to Mars to do these lower altitude magnetic observations. So these are simulated maps of impact basins cooled in a couple different like reversal history or like a non-reversing case as well. But you can see, you sort of get like almost like the same kind of striping you get in seafloor spreading we could look for really similar features like that in the interiors of impact basins if we could get these lower altitude transects. And that would be a way to both directly test whether the dynamo was reversing without actually like seeing samples in hand. And also a way to possibly get more detail about the reversal history if that was occurring. So hopefully this will happen in the next like 10 or 15 years, maybe longer. Missions take a long time, but this would be like a huge useful development. And then of course, we can maybe make do without samples, but really we would like to have samples. Martian sample return, I know, is like kind of a dicey topic right now. Funding situation's weird. Even before it was weird, our sample return was, you know, it's a program. But hopefully it would be amazing to have some of those really old samples from MSR, but they need to be older, you know, than like 3.7 to really be in this kind of hot range for us. So one day, maybe one day. Yeah, and that is all I have for you all today. I think this ran a little fast, but if anyone has questions.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. I enjoyed it. So you studied this 1 centimeter piece of rock, basically. No judgment, no judgment. But has there been any kind of other direct observations or, you know, measurements from other centimeters of rock from other craters that you can compare your own results to?
Are you thinking on Mars or?
Yes, on Mars, yeah.
So most of the meteorites we have from Mars are, okay, I almost said they're useless, but they're not useless. They're very useful. They're useless if you want to know about early Mars. A lot of them are too young. The ones that are older, some of them are really shocked. Some of them, anything we find in like the desert, people always check for meteorites by putting a magnet to it. So sometimes you'll have a perfect meteorite and then somebody's touched it with a magnet. So spread the word to never do that. So there's not really anything else right now that is promising enough to warrant the amount of effort it takes to do this kind of like paleomag. It's really time intensive. And that's the other thing is ALH is sort of uniquely positioned where we have all this really careful, precise information about its impact history, its magnetic mineralogy. We don't have that for, I think, almost any other extraterrestrial samples, let alone from Mars. But I hope one day, yeah, there's a lot of meteorites that could be interesting. Somebody just has to take the time.
So what observations would you hope, if you cannot get a sample returned, what other observations would you hope to get besides the little helicopters that you talked about?
Yeah, so the helicopters are definitely a big thing. I think that's probably the most promising thing that we're going to get just because they can be done sort of cheaply in the scheme of missions. And also could be like, it feels like so much of it's thinking about how would this thing that we want for our science maybe be useful for human exploration so we can justify it better. And they're also like maybe a useful tool that way. So that could be like, what else? I mean, if somebody magically, it would be nice to get another meteorite if something, we could order them. That actually happened with another project I was working on the obrites. We got a new obrite in early 2024. It just like fell in Germany, like right when you need it. So everybody, I don't know if you pray, but if you do, another meteorite maybe.
Okay.
Because there's just not much else that we're going to be able to do. I know there was recently an updated magnetic field model for Mars that incorporates all the MAVEN data, RIP MAVEN. But so maybe we'll learn more digging through that more closely. But it's just really hard with the altitude of the measurements. You just, yeah.
Hey, thank you. Great talk. I'm wondering if you've like thought about the fact that at this time the dynamo would likely be shutting down. And I don't know like how long it takes a dynamo to, shut down and we just do on or off switch, but I don't know, would it like exhibit any multipolar activity that might cause the same effects as a reversing magnetic field, but require less like time or intensity that would allow the moments
Yeah.
to not be strongly magnetized.
It's definitely tricky because I think reversals are like by far the most efficient because you get such like perfect cancellation of the direction, so you can get a small moment. And that's actually probably something that should be done with this down the line, is see what the effect of like asymmetric reversals are, how small you're actually able to get the moment. I think that's probably not the control on it, but sorry, straying a little bit. I wish I knew the answer to that. There are some very talented dynamo researchers in this room that might be better qualified to tell what is happening as dynamos are shutting down, but it's a good question. I wish I could answer it.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could say more about the parts of the crust that are really strongly magnetized. So I know you said maybe the basins are expected to be depleted in the minerals that would carry strong magnet remnants, but like, did you think much about, or what do you think about, like, could the reversal have been going on during then? Because they're so strongly magnetized from orbit, and you know, even without assuming a reverse, like when you're not assuming a reversal, they're like hard to explain how strongly magnetized those rocks are. So if the reversal was like, was there no reversals early on and then they started maybe as it was shutting down or something? Or could it have been reversing the whole time? And if so, then how much more strongly magnetized are they than we think?
That's a great question. Yes, so the thing I kind of default to is like the only reason that reversals are very good at all at reducing the magnetic fields for basins is because basins cool like longer than anything else that we know of on a geologic timescale. Like hundreds of millions of years is a lot faster than lava flows. So it's sort of possible, if you're thinking like about a small enough feature and you believe that it acquired magnetization in a short enough time, that it's just like between crons or like during one cron. And so for some of the strongly magnetized regions, we would need to be able to rule out, we would need to know better when they actually acquired the magnetization to know if reversals are a problem. And whether we need to invoke like a non-reversing period of Mars's history, because that could be something that's necessary. But it's just, yeah, a matter of figuring out like why the highlands are so strongly magnetized, especially because it's like, the other nice thing about basins is it's not that we don't have to worry about hydrothermal alteration, but basins of this size, it's like such a huge melt pool that's like all recrystallized and maybe not insanely porous. And so it's like you can sort of more confidently say that the magnetization is a thermal remnants and it wasn't modified later. And so once we get into stuff with the Southern Highlands and people talking about like widespread hydrothermal systems, like you can get really insane enrichments of magnetite and other stuff that way. But I think, yeah, I would love to personally work more on Southern Highlands stuff. And also I would love if other people dug more into that, because I think it's so complicated that it hasn't gotten quite as much attention. But it would be cool to know if that's like a problem for the reversal story.
Yeah, like it's hasn't really been looked at since your paper, right? Or has it?
The Southern Highlands?
Yeah.
I don't think I even looked at them very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm hopefully somebody's done it. I don't want to say it hasn't and then I'm wrong and I've missed somebody's
Sure,
work,
sure,
but
sure.
yeah. This mic is amazing, by the way.
I fully agree. Very nice talk, Sarah. I'm curious about, so you talked about like the impact basin and how possibly like very low magnetic field intensity you might see at like spacecraft altitude, like a couple 100 kilometers. I was wondering what it might look like at the surface of these impact basins. I'm curious about that because there was I can't remember which year was it. There was like the Zhurong rover data that traversed along like the Utopia Basin, and I think they found like really, really tiny, almost like no magnetic field signatures at the surface of the Utopia Basin. It was like below 10 nanotesla. So I was wondering if there were like let's say if there were like frequent reversals, how might it be compatible with the the drone data?
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh my gosh. Yeah, because the drone data came out, they published that like while we were in the later stages of reviewing this paper. And so we were like, oh gosh, we have to address this. Because we're talking about how much we would love to have low altitude measurements of basins. And then, but like you do still see strong fields at the surface. And so how is that measurement compatible? But the trouble with, so it's quite a short transect. So they're not getting, like there are a lot of places that you can imagine in these where the magnetic field is not very strong, but also the radius that they were at, it's like this, I wish I had the figure in here, but it's like this weird situation where the combination of the geology, like there's a few overlying units that are thick enough that it's sort of attenuating the field what's below, or like you have this bigger offset. And where they are relative to the basin rim is like too far, or it's like too close to the rim to be, like you can kind of see, oh no, did I back up too much? Oh my gosh, I keep messing up you can kind of see it's like there's a weaker region, kind of always, closer to the rim in these. And so we kind of went through and sampled for all of our reversal histories to see at the location that Jurong is at, like everywhere around that radius, how likely would it be to see a field that weak? And it turns out that it's coincidentally really probable. So it's like consistent with that measurement, like they just got exactly the measurement that we can't use, which is so sad because it's like such a cool observation. But I know that my impression anyway was their original measurements were really weak, or they're all weak, but they seem to suggest that there is, like they're not zero. So it seems like something's magnetized, but I think we would need a longer transect to get more information.
Like maybe even deeper, like towards the center of the.
Yeah, that would be definitely really useful. But yeah, that's such a cool measurement they were able to make.
Great. Thanks for the very nice talk, Sarah. So I had a question that this slide kind of talks to. So you look at like an average number of reversals per million years. Do you ever look at, so that's basically assuming like an axial dipole to an axial dipole. And how much do you look at like the intensity changing, or is that kept fixed as it goes through these reversals?
Yeah, the intensity is kept fixed, but it's the way that I tried to build the code very carefully so that we could put in an arbitrary magnetic field history. And that's something we've experimented with a bit on Mercury, actually. And so if there were a good like call to do something more complicated, it would be straightforward to do that. It could be very interesting because that's not something we took into consideration.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Oops, I mean, I have to throw it. That's not good.
Questions too.
Guys.
With that, you can all thank Sarah. Going from here and